There you go. There's the official one. So, Bruchim Abayim, welcome. Of course, we would prefer to be in person, munching on a bagel, sipping some Beth David coffee at one of those round tables, but hopefully that'll be our routine once we get back to January, sometime soon.
Sure.
In any case, it shouldn't in any measure detract from our discussion about the Parashah and whatever else we venture into. So hopefully that will not affect in any way your enjoyment as we discuss Parashat Vayechi today. But before we get to Vayechi, I wanted to take a moment to refer to some of the things I said on Shabbat, because they happen to be relevant to Vayechi as well. I spoke about apology, forgiveness, reconciliation. And despite all the, I'd say, hostility and violence that's going on, there's some very positive signs about an approach and openness to reconciliation, especially in Canada. I mean, with all the criticism we have of what the government has done or not done over the years, and all the horrible things that have been done in the past, the fact that there's finally a more open willingness to talk about not just apology, but to move beyond that apology and take steps to address the injustices that have occurred in the past. I was particularly moved this week by the speech by the Minister of Defense talking about the apology for sexual misconduct in the Canadian Armed Forces. I just want to read a couple of passages. It's a very short, relatively short official apology, but I just want to read a couple of passages from it, because they say something a little bit about some of the things we read about in this week's Parashah, and I'll get to that a little bit later. Anybody see that live or hear or read the apology by the Minister of Defense? Maybe not. Okay. So I'll just, after the introduction about who serves in the armed forces and the importance that we've always placed on the dedication and commitment of those who serve in various branches of the armed forces, it says this: "You have always had Canadians' backs, and we should always have yours. Far too many members of the Canadian Armed Forces, veterans, current and former employees of the Department of National Defense, and staff of the non-public funds have suffered sexual harassment, sexual assault, or discrimination based on sex, gender identity, and sexual orientation. This misconduct and abuse of power led to a crisis of broken trust in the defense teams." I emphasize that because this idea of trust is as important as anything else. And here's the apology. "Today, as Minister of National Defense, I am apologizing to you on behalf of the Government of Canada. We must acknowledge the pain and trauma that so many have endured, because the very institution charged with protecting and defending our country has not always protected and defended its own members. I apologize on behalf of the Government of Canada and on behalf of those elected officials who throughout the history of the Canadian Armed Forces had the responsibility to protect you and who failed to do so. These institutions failed you, and for that we are sorry. I am sorry. I apologize to everyone affected. I acknowledge that successive governments have not done nearly enough to stamp out this scourge. To all the Canadians who signed up to serve our country full of hope, zeal, and spirit, to those who have always dreamed of putting on a uniform and who answered the call of service only to find their own calls for help ignored, their calls for justice and dignity disregarded, and their faith in our institution betrayed, we are sorry. I am sorry." And the last part, I won't read the details. It just says, "Today we pledge this. Things can change, they must change, and they will change." So there are a number of elements of this. There's first the aspect of apologizing. The time it takes for an apology to come about. I mean, these studies have been out for years, and there was a study done 5 years ago that was released, and nothing was done. And things continued, these abuses continued to occur in the armed forces, and it's only now that there's this atmosphere, this environment of the possibility of acknowledging responsibility on behalf of institutions, whether it be the government, the armed forces, and others, for injustice and worse done to hundreds. It's not a handful of people. It's hundreds and hundreds of complaints. As a matter of fact, there's 19,000 complaints issued over the last 20 years by members of the armed forces in various contexts. So it tells you how rampant this has been. And that's depressing in a sense. But the fact that the government, through the Minister of Defense, has finally come out and acknowledged this and taken responsibility. And furthermore, it's not just the apology, that there's going to be all sorts of action taken to re-educate people who are in the armed forces, to educate properly people who enter the armed forces, to make sure that this is something that's not tolerated anywhere. How that plays out and whether it'll be effective, I don't know. But the fact that there are measures being taken and compensation discussed, the concrete action that needs to be taken following apology is hopefully something that's going to be taken seriously by the government and whatever institutions need in order to implement all these recommendations. And in another interesting development this week, you probably heard that we've talked about the apology made by Prime Minister Harper to the Indigenous peoples back in 2008, and the calls for action by the TRC, 94 of them, of which many have not even been started, let alone partially implemented. But these things are starting to happen. Just this past week, Ottawa decided to set aside $40 billion for Indigenous children and First Nations families. And of course, it's very late and not something that's going to help a lot of these families who've been dealing with these generational trauma for decades. But the fact that things are starting to happen, and even at a time of COVID, when resources are scarce, the government has at least pledged, and we'll see if they're able to follow up on this, an incredible amount of money that will hopefully address some of the injustice that exists in the child welfare system, particularly with regards to its discrimination documented of Indigenous children. So when you read about the background and the history of all these deeds and actions in the past, it's very depressing that this has gone on in our country for hundreds of years and certainly in recent decades, and nothing substantial or significant has been done to address it, let alone acknowledge it. But perhaps that's starting to change, and perhaps there's a more openness about acknowledging and accepting responsibility and doing something about it. And I hope that's a direction we continue to see in a variety of issues, not just these two, but which are incredibly significant today. But I find that rather encouraging that this has all happened this past week. And as I mentioned, on Monday, next week, in a few days, that meeting between representatives from First Nations and Indigenous peoples across Canada has a meeting with the Pope this coming Monday. And it'll be fascinating to see exactly what happens as a result of that meeting. If we're talking about acknowledging injustice done over centuries to the Indigenous peoples through the instrument of the Catholic Church in Canada, not only, but certainly a significant player in that. And we'll see whether the Pope is willing to acknowledge and take responsibility for all those who didn't act in the past on behalf of an institution, just as the defense minister took responsibility and apologized on behalf of the government of Canada. It's not on the part of an individual. It's not one person who perpetrated this. It's the inaction of the generations of officials, elected or otherwise, who have not done anywhere near enough to address this issue. Similarly in the Catholic Church, and we'll see how that plays out. So all these various events of acknowledgement and accepting responsibility going on in Canada and in other places is something that I think is greatly encouraging. And if I gave you 5 minutes to tell me about things that are going in the other way, I know you'd have no problem doing that. But that's, we sometimes we have to focus on things that are going in the right direction, at least occasionally. So over to our Parashah. So why do I think this is relevant in our Parashah? Because as I mentioned last Shabbat, there is never a genuine, deep reconciliation that takes place within the patriarchal and matriarchal families here. it doesn't happen. There are all sorts of indications that the meeting that takes place between Joseph and his father it is not something that resolves the tension and the conflict that had existed for years. And we see this in some of the statements that Jacob makes upon meeting his son Joseph, and also later on when he was about to die. And that's probably what we want to focus on today. So if you have a Chumash, does everyone have a Chumash, by the way? Everyone access to something? No? Okay, so as we're talking, I'll try to bring up something on screen. So, or just listen to the verses. You don't need necessarily to see the text in front of you, but I will try to get that up as we're going on here. Give me 1 second here, so just have it ready. You can easily always access the text best. I think the best software today, or the link is sefaria.org. They've got everything there, not just Tanakh, but a whole variety of rabbinic sources and others. And it's certainly worth accessing that. But I'll bring that up for you so you can see when we get to a relevant part. So let's go to 47. Okay. Okay, hello, Ruth. Okay, so just let me know when it comes up on screen. I'll try to share it with you so you have access to some of the verses we're going to be considering. Okay, I'll try to make it a little bit bigger. I see people adjusting their glasses. Okay, if you have access to your own, it's easier. All right. So I'm going to move a little bit. So let's go here. If you look at chapter 48, sorry, just 1 second. Chapter 47, verse 29. So what does it say? Is Vaykravu Yemei Yisrael Lamut, Vayikra Livno Yosef, Vayomer Lo. So first of all, Israel, not referred to Jacob here, Israel, and possibly because as Israel, Jacob is now thinking of the next generation. He's thinking about what's to happen after he dies. And Israel is perhaps the best name for that patriarch in terms of continuity, because of course afterwards his children are referred to as Bnei Israel, and the Israelites continue to be referred to as Bnei Israel throughout the period of the judges and kings. That's their name. That's they're no longer called by individual tribes, at least when talking about the collective. They're called Bnei Israel, harking back to the sons of Israel, sons of Jacob. All right, so what do you find interesting here in this verse? When the time approached for Israel to die, he summoned his son Joseph and said to him. So what's interesting about that? The fact that he summons Joseph. What about the other sons? I mean, certainly he hadn't seen Joseph for 20 plus years, but if he's about to die, why does he first summon Joseph? Because afterwards, a little bit later, he says, Hey Asfu, he gathers all his sons together, all his children, but he's calling Joseph first. So what's the reason for that?
Well, probably he thinks he's the most dependable in the sense that he had a good position in Egypt and would have the authority to do this.
Is he still his favorite?
Probably still his favorite, even though he still has Benjamin, of course. But Joseph, he sees some kind of fulfillment of the true role of the next generations of patriarchs and matriarchs. Somebody who has the ability, the resources, the cunning to be able to fulfill the prophecy that Jacob and his father and grandfather had received. It's interesting also, it says, Vayikra livno Yosef. he summoned his son Joseph. What other Joseph is there? Why does it need to mention his son Joseph? So I find that interesting because I was thinking the other day when I read this, I said, when I talk about going to visit my father, I always say, I'm going to visit my father. Like, why do I have to say my, like who else's father would I be going to visit? Why do I have to mention this, my father? Why does there have to be some description? Why can't I say, I'm going to visit dad? And people do say that, but I just know that when I say that I'm going to visit my father, I always have to say my father, as if there's this need to identify and to strengthen and reinforce a relationship. Not because there's a question about it, but I guess it perhaps is some kind of additional grounding foundation of it. And here the same thing, Vayikra Lifno Yosef. Is that saying something about the way he refers to his other sons? His real son is Joseph. The others, they're children by marriage. They're children by the fact that that's what patriarchs did back then. They had as many children as possible, or at least tried to. But the fact that he hasn't mentioned Livno Yosef, Joseph is the one he feels that in terms of a child who's going to inherit and carry on a tradition, carry on a legacy, Joseph is the one that he can count on, as some of you mentioned before. Joseph is the one that has the ability, the resources to perhaps to follow up on that legacy. And perhaps that's the necessity of having Livno Yosef, because if you had Vayikra Yosef, we wouldn't have said two things about it. He called Joseph. The other element of it that came to me is that when he says Livno Yosef, because when he said Vayikra Yosef, Joseph has a role, a task, a reputation, a status in Egypt. That status has nothing to do with the fact that he's Jacob's son, Israel's son. That's incidental to Egyptians. They don't really care who his father is. They just know he's the one who saved them. So by saying that he's calling his son Joseph, he's trying to remind perhaps either himself or Joseph, or at least the narrator is, that Joseph still has a status of son. And despite all the interesting things that have happened over the last few Parashiyot with the relationships between the brothers and the reunification with his father, this idea that Joseph should not forget that he has a status as the son of Jacob, the son of Israel, the son of Rachel, meaning that he comes from somewhere. It's not just where he happens to be at this moment. It's not just the status and the reputation he's achieved in Egypt and all that success, but he comes from somewhere else. And perhaps Jacob, by calling to his son Joseph, is trying to say, just remember who you are. You may be the most important person, except for Pharaoh, perhaps, in Egypt, but you're the son of a family that's come from somewhere else and has the destiny somewhere else. Our destiny is not in Egypt. Our current fate, our immediate experiences for the next several generations as slaves is here, but that's not our destiny. That's a stage in the life of a formative stage in the life of a imminent people, but that's not where we're supposed to be. And you got to remember that. You have something else, you have another destiny in mind. And so when we see by Vayikra Yosef, whether the narrator or whoever included that had that in mind, I don't know. But it's not coincidental that the status or the relationship between Joseph and his father is mentioned here, because we could easily have done without it. Sharon, you wanted to say something? Or
well, you said a lot. Where am I? A lot of what I was going to say, you did mention, about the position that Joseph held, and that he thought that his position that Joseph held he would be able to fulfill whatever wish he's going to ask Joseph. He's going to ask to be done. And as we find out in the next line, it's not to be buried in Egypt. And perhaps he felt that his other sons could not fulfill it. So he's asking Joseph. I don't take Joseph, not Joseph, I don't take Israel or Jacob, whatever, as looking to the future and thinking that. I don't know. Maybe you're right. Maybe that's what they mean by that. That's why he was thinking. I think he was thinking about himself. I don't know why. I don't find him a man. I find him a little bit selfish at times. From what I've been reading. So I think he was more interested in himself, and he knew that Joseph would probably get the job done and do it. And that's how I take it.
Okay, and I think part of that is reflected maybe in the continuation of that same verse where it says, do not bury me in Egypt. I mean, you may have some kind of cultural ties here, having lived here for so many years, and you may have taken an Egyptian wife, and you may dress like an Egyptian, maybe even walk like an Egyptian, but I want to be buried where my fathers were buried, where my grandfather was buried, where I buried my wife, Leah. And interesting, if you look at this thing, the verse a little bit later, or just a little later, he talks about the fact also that back in the land of my ancestors, where I also buried Rachel, but in Beit Lechem. And one of the commentators says that why would Jacob mention at this point? They say, interestingly, although it's certainly not clear from the text, that maybe it's an apology to Joseph for not burying his mother where all the other patriarchs and matriarchs are buried. Leah was buried there, but I buried your mother in Beit Lechem because she died on the way, and then I wasn't. I gave in to circumstances and couldn't do more than that. So, but this idea of connection with the land is certainly very powerful, and perhaps Joseph again has the resources to do it, as we see later on. Joseph goes to great lengths once his father passes to be in a period of mourning, and then turn to Pharaoh, if not directly, but through an intermediary, to ask him if it's okay if I take my leave and go and bury my father as per his request. And Pharaoh grants the request without any hesitation whatsoever. So Joseph takes this pledge very seriously. And as you probably saw, there's this form of a pledge back here.
Under his thigh.
Under his thigh. The power of making a pledge, we talk about our word, but the word without some kind of tangible gesture in ancient times, particularly in the Bible, was not as powerful. And the idea of placing your hand on someone's thigh, the thigh, I guess, is closest you get to the reproductive power of males. I mean, I guess it would probably be inappropriate to go beyond that, but the thigh is as close as possible, and putting your hand on somebody's thigh indicates how serious you take that pledge, and that's something that you would lest break at any time. So the connection with the land, the pledge to his father, is something that Joseph takes very seriously and certainly executes that later on in the Parashah. So I want to go to the next stage where he says later on, and this is earlier, of course. This is before Jacob's about to die. This is when he's still relatively, I suppose you might say, in full power of his faculties, possibly both physical and mental. Before you might be able to, while you still have the capacity to make cognizant decisions about what you want to happen later on. Later on, he does get sick, and Joseph, it's said to Joseph, and again, very powerfully indicating that he wasn't in touch with his father. Sometime after Joseph was told, your father is ill. He didn't know that his father was ill. Was he not regularly in touch after he'd received that mission and that blessing from his father? Is that the last time he saw his father until now? It's only a few verses later, but it seems like quite a while later if you look at it. After some time afterward. What is that sometime? Is it a few weeks, a few months, a few years? Who knows? But the fact that Joseph was not in touch with his father says something about the lack of true reconciliation there. Whether his father never forgave him, it's not mentioned, for not saying that he was in Egypt and trying to reestablish contact all those years, or whether Joseph still has some anger at his father for not properly dealing with the brothers when he was a youth, leading to his incarceration and whatever happened to him in Egypt. We don't know. It's nothing is spoken, at least nothing is talked about here. We don't know anything about that. Anna.
Yes, I just have a question. If you go back one paragraph where, yes, stop. Israel bowed at the head of the bed. What significance is that?
Good question. It's not something we see very often. They say here in the Eitz Chaim, being an invalid, he didn't really have the strength to do a lot, so he's able at least to make some symbolic gesture of bowing, perhaps as gratitude to Joseph, or an expression of thanks and praise to God. This is the explanation given. So it's not something we read about, bowing at the head of the bed. I don't know where else that comes up in the Tanakh. It's a good question, but beyond that, I can't give you any more specific answer. But good to notice that, because it's not something that seems very common. That's true. Okay, so let's just go to the next part where Joseph hears about his father's illness and comes there. And it says he brings his two sons with him, Manasseh and Ephraim. And then it's interestingly, it says it was said to Jacob, here is your son, again, Joseph, this idea, he bincha Yosef. It's not the vizier, the grand vizier of Egypt, it's your son, Joseph, who's here. So he's not here in some official capacity to visit an elderly invalid, but he's there as the son to comfort his father, whether or not he's seen him recently or not. But what's interesting is that there's no introduction. It says specifically he brought his two sons with him, Manasseh and Ephraim, but there's no introduction of the sons, only of Joseph. And why that is, we don't know, but perhaps something that comes up afterwards is of interest, because what does Joseph say? What does Jacob say after this? He says to him, who are these? Here it is in verse 8. All of a sudden he saw the sons of Joseph, and it says, who are these? Who are these? Now, granted, his eyesight was not that good, but if you look at just a couple verses earlier, it says, he's aware of the fact that his two sons, now your two sons who were born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to Egypt shall be mine. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine no less than Reuven and Shimon. And what's fascinating here is that it says something that, again, this idea that Jacob, Israel is focused on what's going to happen next, the next generations. And it mentions particularly that these sons are going to be as close to him as Reuven and Shimon were, meaning the elders, his oldest sons, Reuven and Shimon, now Ephraim and Manasseh are going to be the ones that carry on the legacy, because the legacy has not been passed through Reuven and Shimon. He's saying this very powerfully. It's being passed through Joseph and through to his children, Ephraim and Manasseh. You don't have a legacy passed down through 12 sons. You got to choose somebody. Just like Abraham had to choose Yitzhak over Ishmael, just like Isaac had to choose Yaakov over Esav, so Jacob has to choose one. He's chosen Joseph, it's quite clear. And now he's saying to Joseph, and your sons, your two sons, are going to be the ones who carry on the legacy after you. But what's fascinating here is that it says a little earlier, I won't go back and forth, it says that Joseph brought with him his sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, because Manasseh is the older. Ephraim is the second child. But here already, Jacob is saying, your sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. He's already putting Ephraim before Manasseh. And why am I mentioning that? Because just later on, what happens? He says he wants to bless his sons. Joseph pushes his sons toward Jacob, and it goes to at great lengths in the text to describe he takes Manasseh and puts him on the left, so he'll have so the right hand of Jacob would be able to touch him, and he puts Ephraim on the other side, so the left hand. It is very, very specific what Joseph is doing. I want to make sure that my older son Manasseh gets blessed by the right hand of Jacob, indicating he's the preferred, the elder son, who's supposed to get the more significant blessing. and Ephraim will be on the left to get the blessing from the left hand. Again, it tells you about people weren't ambidextrous back then. So the right side, the right hand always meant preference and privilege and priority. And it mentions that, interestingly, we see that, and it becomes a fascinating incident. Oh yeah, but Joseph perhaps wasn't listening when Jacob spoke here. He said right here, he put Ephraim before Manasseh. But it doesn't seem that Joseph gathered that in, because when he puts the sons there, Joseph bows down and doesn't kind of notice things. And then of course, we know that Yaakov sikel et yadav, he crossed his hands over. And some people say, at least one of the commentators explains sikel, from sechel. He did it with wisdom. He knew that Ephraim would be the more prominent of the sons, and therefore, with wisdom, he crossed his hands over to make sure that Ephraim got the preeminent blessing. In any case, Joseph only notices when he lifts up his head and says, "Oh, what's going on here? Dad, you got the wrong hands. You crossed your hands by accident. That's not right." And then, of course, Jacob explains to him, "No, unfortunately, Ephraim is the one who's going to be the one who will be more prominent than his brother Manasseh, even though he is the younger." And if you think about it, why is that such a surprise? Why is it such a surprise? The commentators try to say, well, younger brothers often take preeminent position in the Genesis narrative. Why? Because the Bible, in their eyes, these commentators, the Bible's trying to say, it's not a matter of when you were born or to whom you were born necessarily, although it's very much a case of that, or if you're the first son or the not. It's by merit. Whoever deserves that to be able to carry on a legacy and deserves the inheritance, material or ethical or moral or whatever, that's how you get to that position. But what's fascinating is that just about in every generation in the Genesis narrative, it's never the older son. It's become the tradition, the convention, that it's always a younger son that gets the blessing. And of course, what's happened here just a few verses ago, and we don't know how long ago it was, whether it was weeks or months, Joseph got the blessing from his father. Joseph gets the legacy. He says, "Joseph, you're the one who's going to be carrying on things. You're the one who's going to be responsible for getting me buried in the land of Canaan. You're the one I count on. You're the main son. You're a younger son. You're not the oldest son." So why should Joseph be so surprised when he's hoping that it doesn't happen with his sons? So it teaches us something, that it's wonderful to see how merit can work. The younger son, or whoever merits the privilege, should be the one who gets it. But still, people are immersed in the dominant and the prevailing cultural attitudes of the time. Joseph as well. Why does he assume that Manasseh should get the blessing? Because he's the older son, even though his whole family, for 3 generations now, it's never been the older son who gets the main blessing. It's always a younger son or the younger son. And yet Joseph is still so immersed and stuck in that cultural convention that he's not willing to see it immediately when his father decides to give Ephraim, the younger son, the blessing. So I find that whole exchange is fascinating, because you'd think that Joseph would have been, of all people, Joseph should have been the one who's able to accept and acknowledge that that's the case. And maybe he thought that Manasseh deserved it more. But he didn't say that. All he says is, Manasseh's the older one. Why are we changing a tradition? Well, the tradition was changed back in the time of Abraham. So this whole exchange here is a really, really interesting one. And it says a lot about culture, how sometimes we stick with cultural conventions, even when our lives have demonstrated and in different generations that that's not usually the case, but still we refuse to let go of a convention that we assume is going to be relevant for our family as well.
Barbara, I think, is first.
Sorry, what was that?
Michael?
I think Barbara had her hand up first.
Go ahead, Barb. Go ahead, Barb.
It's so fascinating what you are saying, because when we bless our children on Shabbat Friday night, we always say Ephraim v'Manasseh. And so that has carried through all the way up to 2021 and will continue.
That's right. Here's the blessing. It comes directly word for word from here. It says, Yisimcha Elohim. Let me just get a little further here. Here it is, verse 20. Yisimcha Elohim ki Ephraim v'chi Menashe.
Oh,
That's what we always
my.
say before we start with the Yavarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha. We start with that, and it's saying ki Ephraim v'chi Menashe. In essence, maybe we're doing that because Jacob said it, and it becomes a relevant and important message. But perhaps we're saying, you know what, whoever our sons, wherever our children are, don't make assumptions that because you're the oldest, you're the most capable, or you're the one who's going to inherit the most in whatever way we describe. In the past, Ephraim was the one who received it before Menashe, and we continue to say that. We say that incredibly emphatically, that even though Ephraim was the younger son, he's the one who's placed first here. So that perhaps has become part of our tradition, whether aware of it or not. Sharon, you wanted to add something?
I don't know what's going to add on. I think I got a little mixed up with the time frame of where we are. We really didn't become Jews yet, right? We weren't Jews until after the Exodus. Is that right?
That's right. At this point, we're B'nai Yisrael in
Israelites.
Hebrew or Israelites.
Hebrews or Israelites, yeah. Because
that's right.
I was thinking that Joseph, his wife, isn't Jewish, right? She's Egyptian.
She's
And
not
yet-
Jewish. There were no
Right.
Jews. You
So-
can't use that term back here.
Pardon?
You can't use the term Jewish back then. It's idiosyncratic.
Exactly.
There are no Jews at this time.
Because of that, because I'm thinking like today, present day, a Jewish child is passed on through the mother maternally. Here you've got a woman who was not Jewish. Oh, sorry about this. Hold on, trying to hang up. We got someone who's Jewish and who's not Jewish, and the children are being passed on. But this, we're back to the Hebrew, so it's okay.
Keep in
It's
mind,
okay in the
Sharon.
sense that my question, I withdraw it then.
Okay, that's fine. Just keep in mind as well, back then, the idea of we talk about the emphasis that the patriarchs and matriarchs place on their children marrying somebody from the family, not the local girls. That, it's something we've talked about in the past. But the idea of intermarriage was not critical at that time, because we know of many instances later on in the time of the prophets, the kings, of course. People took wives who were not from the Israelite tribes. People took wives from among the other peoples. King Solomon, of all people, took many wives who were certainly not Jewish. They weren't Israelite. They were
Right.
from the different nations. Some of them may have been politically oriented and motivated, but it doesn't matter. He took wives from others, and many others did as well. And there are many instances in the Bible where we read about people who took a wife from here and a wife from there. There was no official conversion process in the Bible as well. You just assumed whomever you brought into your family would accept the practices of your family. So it's not shocking that Joseph had an Egyptian wife. There were no Israelites around. Who did you want him to marry? He wasn't going to go up to Haran, where his father went to find a wife. He lived in Egypt. He married an Egyptian wife. So taking this blessing of his sons, who you'll say, well, he wasn't born to a Jewish mother, how can they be Jewish? Well, it's not relevant. That wasn't an issue. This idea of the blood connection to mother or father was not something that was a biblical priority. So we can't take that. You got to understand that in context. Ephraim and Menashe were Jacob's sons. That's all that's important to us right now. We don't care who the mother was. We also, interestingly, when we get to the end, I don't want to go too late. When we get to the end of the Parsha, it talks about the fact that right at the end, if we're talking about the issue of culture and influence, it says Vayamot Yosef, then Mea ve'eser shanim. It talks about Joseph. It never, interestingly, except when Pharaoh names him as such, it never mentions Joseph's Egyptian name, Safnat Paneach. He had an Egyptian name, and obviously he was known to the Egyptians by the Egyptian name. It's unlikely that Egyptians referred to him as Joseph, because Pharaoh had given him this name. But the narrative in Genesis never uses that name again. And when we talk about Joseph interacting with Egyptians, whether it's the people who are going to mummify his father's body, whether it's the people who are going to be his intermediaries with Pharaoh when he asks to go bury his father, it always talks about Joseph. We assume that that's the way Egyptians referred to him. But it's unlikely. It's more likely that he was referred to by his Egyptian name. It would have been somewhat uncomfortable, to say the least, to Egyptians to recognize the foreignness of somebody who becomes so powerful. So I assume the biblical text and narrative insists on using only Joseph's name, but it makes us aware of the fact that he did have an Egyptian name, he had an Egyptian wife, and whether through Hollywood or other places, he certainly dressed like an Egyptian because that was his task. At the same time, the text, through what we mentioned before, wants us to remember, as readers, and perhaps Joseph as well, that he is still the son of Jacob, the son of Israel. And at the end, when he dies, it mentions very clearly his name of Joseph, even though he's embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt. Certainly not what was the traditional Israelite practice at the time, where people, as we know, were buried in caves. The embalming, mummifying was an Egyptian process and understanding of what happens during and after death. That's not part of the Israelite belief at that time. And that's why Jacob is so insistent, even though he is initially embalmed, he insists on being taken. That probably his greatest fear was to be embalmed and left in some kind of coffin at the base of a tiny little pyramid in Egypt. He wanted to be buried where his family is buried. So that cultural element is very significant to Jacob at the end of his life, and something Joseph also appreciates, because what does he say to his brothers? He says, swear to me. It doesn't say that they place their hands on his thigh, but he says, swear to me that when I die, your descendants, you, because he knows he's going to die before his brothers, interestingly, you will have my body, my coffin, taken and buried in the Holy Land, in the Promised Land, in the land that we're supposed to inherit as a people. And as we know, one of the more interesting elements of the Exodus is when Moses himself, as a descendant of one of Joseph's brothers, goes and takes Joseph's remains, and whether he himself carried them or he had people help him, I don't know, but he makes sure that they're not left in Egypt. And we all know that Joseph, at least according to the Bible, is buried near the city of Shechem, where the grave of Joseph is at least recognized to this day. So this issue, which apparently he understood the importance from his father of maintaining certain cultural elements, such as being buried, if not in the same cave, at least in the same land as the fathers had. And interestingly, one last point, I mean, we go on forever on this parsha, it's fascinating. One of the commentators says, the end of the parsha says this, Vayamot Yosef ben me'ah ve'eser shanim, vayachantu oto, vayisem baron b'mitzrayim. Joseph died at the age of 110 years, and he was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt. And then how does Shmot begin? Well, obviously, ve'ele Shmot b'nei Yisrael. So why is it interesting that those two verses come one after the other? They say that's an indication of the tradition, proven by the existence of that tradition, at least. That's an explanation for the cause of it, that when we're buried, on the tombstone, we place the names of our family. Who do we place on the name of the tombstone? We place our name and the names of our parents, for the most part, both mother and father, meaning that this connection with burial is both a location, it's a specific site where we're being buried, i.e. in a Jewish cemetery. Read in ancient time, the only Israelite cemetery that existed back then, Marat HaMachpelah in Hebron. So the location is essential, but the connection to where we've come from and who our people is essential as well. To be buried in Egypt and to say Joseph Safnat Paneach was a wonderful vizier, saved Egypt from famine, if that were put on Joseph's tombstone or in hieroglyphic on the wall of his tomb at the base of a pyramid, that's not Jewish. That's not even Israelite. This idea of making sure that the names, so we understand where we've come from, need to be placed on the stone. It's not enough to write an epitaph on a stone. Here lies so-and-so, wonderful humanitarian, came up with all sorts of wonderful ways to save people during COVID, came up with what the most effective of the vaccines. If you don't say, and if that person happened to be Jewish, if you don't say who his father and mother are, then you're not respecting the Jewish tradition of including names. So at least this is the idea that the burial and names come one after the other. This very powerful connection to tradition of remembering to whom we really supposedly should feel a belonging to. I'll end on that. As I said, there's tons of other stuff we could talk about. But if anyone has any questions or comments, I'll invite you to do so. Ruth.
I've just been looking at the end of this Parashah, and it says twice that he was 110 years when he died, Joseph. Why
So
is that?
Why do you think? Why do you think they'd emphasize that?
I don't know. That's why I'm asking.
Anybody have any idea? Because we read about the years that each of the patriarchs lived. We don't. Interestingly, the matriarchs. That's not always mentioned. But we know how long Abraham lived. We know how long Jacob lived. We know how long Isaac lived. And we know how long Joseph lived. Joseph lived the shortest of all the patriarchs. He only lived 110 years. All the others lived at least a generation longer.
How long did his brothers live? It doesn't say that.
Doesn't say.
And they're all buried in Israel too.
There are traditions that place their graves somewhere, but we have no biblical indication of them being buried like we do of Joseph. We know of Joseph, we know of his father, grandfather, and grandparents, but we don't know about any of the other brothers from any biblical connection.
I don't know if people go to their burial sites, like in Beit Shemesh is down, I think.
So I'll read you a commentary that ties in with what I mentioned before. It's called Shar Bat Rabim. That's the name of the commentary. So it says, Why does the text mention twice the number of years that Joseph lived? It comes to teach us that he died with a good name, the name of Joseph, even though he was king for 80 years. In any case, he didn't forget that his name is Hebrew, something we talked about before, as opposed to Tzafnat Paneach, and he didn't want to call himself as Pharaoh had called him, Tzafnat Paneach, but specifically Joseph, for all time. So he's not known. We never refer to him as Tzafnat Paneach, just that one time. So the fact that it mentions it twice is trying to emphasize the fact that despite of those 110 years, 80 years, he lived in Egypt and lived in a very important Egyptian status. Still, it was essential for him to maintain the fact that despite all those years, he still saw himself as an Ivri, as the son of Jacob, and with his Hebrew name, Joseph, Yosef.
Well,
yeah.
I just went further and I was reading chapter 49, and this is when Jacob is talking to his sons, and the first one is Reuben. And he goes on, he says to Reuben, "You're my firstborn, my might, my first fruit of my vigor, exceeding in rank and exceeding in honor. Unstable as water, you shall excel no longer. But when you mounted your father's bed," does that mean he slept with one of his father's wives?
One of his concubines, you got it.
Yeah, okay. I'm just trying to understand the language back there. Okay.
Yeah, no, Jacob,
Not good.
However old Jacob was, he apparently continues to bear grudges until his dying day.
Well, who would be happy about sleeping with, mind you, some people's marriage, forget it. Okay, stop there.
Anyone else have any comments, questions? Barb, go ahead.
When you talk about names and naming people, where did the tradition come from us naming our children after former generations or former relatives? Because on the tombstones, we always name our parents and grandparents, there's that lineage. When did that start that we continue to do that? Was that with Jacob?
Good question. I'm not sure. I'm not sure exactly when that tradition started of naming after relatives who passed away, and in the Sephardi tradition, naming after often living relatives. They don't have an issue with that, as the Ashkenazi tradition does. It's a good question, Barbara. I don't know exactly when that started. I don't imagine it's all that ancient. It's probably something in the last few hundred years. It may have something to do with the history of Jews moving from place to place and often being attacked, assaulted, sometimes sexually assaulted, and often trying to maintain names of relatives. I don't know. There could be a lot of
or keeping our past alive.
Keeping our past alive, and specifically with connection to recent generations of ancestors who are no longer alive. But I don't know when that started. That's a good question.
Okay.
I was always told you named after the dead was because you wanted the good people. You wanted to imbue the good qualities of that person into your child, right? So I find like my grandchildren are named after my parents. And sometimes they'll ask me questions about my parents, different things. So I'll say, oh, Billy Ruth would be so proud of you. Oh, you just do the same thing as she does, and there's a glow about it, And
yeah, I think that's very true. It allows us to, give some life and legacy to people who are no longer around.
Exactly.
Exactly when it started, though, I couldn't say.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all for joining me again. Always a pleasure to see you. And hopefully sometime in January, we'll have a chance to meet in person again over bagel and coffee, and maybe better.
Absolutely.
Maybe.
Thank you.
Everybody stay safe and healthy and stay well and careful. Thank you so much. So interesting.
Thank you,
Thank you very
Michael.
much. Bye.